ado, thank you everyone who's joined this webinar, this panel on Trump 2.0, what his presidency might look like in terms of trade policy. So, we're going to divide this discussion into 4 different parts. First, I will let me introduce myself. My name is Rodrigo Inurreta. I'm Federal Affairs Manager at EDP Renewables. I cover all things related to our relationship with the U.S. Congress and also our relationship with the Mexican government. And I specialize on tax policy, which is why my colleagues here are going to talk about trade policy, and I will moderate this panel. So I'm pleased to be here with you all. So first of all, let me tell you how we're going to structure the conversation. I will let our stellar panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to move to 3 presentations. First, we will discuss what's the legal and political framework of U.S. trade policy, how U.S. trade policy is set by the United States government and by the private sector. The second part of our conversation will be about where things stand right now, a week into Trump's presidency. What can we expect from the new president and his team, and how that might have an impact on the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. And third, we're going to talk about how this landscape might affect companies in the U.S. We usually focus on, what the decision-making process looks like from the White House and from Congress, but we don't take into account necessarily what the private sector has to navigate in the U.S. when there is these changes. The example that we're going to use this time is the clean energy sector, what the impact might be in the supply chain for the clean energy sector. So without further ado, I will let the panelists introduce yourselves. I will just point you in the order that you appear. I will be a little dictator as a good moderator here. So I will hand it to you based on how you look on my screen. So over to you, Tom.
Great, thank you, Rodrigo, and hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Tom Stars. I'm with a company called EDP Renewables. It's a US-based, Houston-based company, actually, that's a subsidiary of EDP Renewables, the large global company based in Portugal. My role is I lead 4 different departments at EDPR: government relations, regulatory affairs, marketing, and communications. And I've been working in the clean energy sector really my whole adult life. So I've been working in the law at the intersection of technology, markets, and policy in the clean energy sector since really the 1980s. Thank you, and it's good to be here.
Thank you very much, Tom. Over to you, Stacy.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm excited for this presentation this evening. I am Stacy Ettinger. I am the Senior Vice President at the Solar Energy Industries Association. We represent over 1,200 companies that manufacture, deploy everything in the solar and energy storage space. I have a long career in Washington, including working in the executive branch at the Commerce Department, working on Capitol Hill for Senator Chuck Schumer from New York, who is the Democratic leader in the Senate, and then 7 years at a big global law firm. And now I'm at the association. I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
And now your turn, Vanessa.
So hello, everyone. I'm Vanessa Sciarra. I'm a Vice President for Trade and International Competitiveness at the American Clean Power Association. So our association is a sister association to Stacy's. One of the differentiators is that we also cover wind power, onshore and offshore wind. And we are also only representing companies in the utility grade space, which are the large projects that interconnect with the grid. So that is sort of the specific place that we operate in. My background is similar to Stacy's. We met actually when we were working in the government. I was at the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep, which is another agency along with Commerce Department that does work on the trade space. That was followed by a career with 2 law firms for a number of years working for clients on import matters. And then I've been in the trade association world for about 10 years, the most recent 4 years at American Clean Power Association doing clean energy work. So very nice to be here tonight.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. Thank you very much for all of our panelists, And I forgot a small detail. So after each of the sections, I will open it up for questions. I will read questions from the audience on the chat. And then, after each section, there's going to be a Q&A, and then we'll wrap up with another Q&A after the 3 sections. So with that said, I will hand it over to you, Stacy. So you set the stage in terms of how U.S. policy is made, basically. So thank you once again.
Yeah, as we say in the United States, basically how the sausage is made.
The sausage is made. I was tempted to say that.
Yeah, I don't know if that translates well, but anyway, let me just sort of a basic overview of the sort of construct of the United States sort of government, right? So we have a constitution. The Constitution establishes 3 separate but equal branches of government. So we have the legislative branch, Congress. They are responsible for making laws. The Congress is, there are 2 bodies in the Congress, the U.S. House of Representatives with 435 members. Republicans currently control the House. The United States Senate has 100 senators, 2 from each state. The Republicans also control the Senate. The second branch of government, the executive branch, is headed by the president. It also includes federal agencies, and those agencies are responsible for enforcing the laws that are passed by the U.S. Congress. The president also nominates the head, appoints we call them political appointees that will lead each of the agencies, as well as senior officials. The president also appoints or nominates, I should say, judges, and both the nominees to lead agencies, as well as judges, go through a Senate confirmation process and need to be voted out and confirmed by the Senate before they can take their jobs. One of the things to think about is how politics plays a role in both Congress and the executive branch, and hopefully not the court. So not supposed to play a role in our judicial system. But again, Congress passes and amends laws. The majority in the House basically controls everything. In the Senate, it is different. You need, in most instances, at least 60 senators that want to move the process along when it comes to legislation. I mentioned the executive branch enforces trade laws. So USTR is part of the executive branch. They are actually part of the White House. And all the federal agencies, including trade agencies like the Commerce Department, are also part of that executive branch. And the judicial branch, there are 2 main courts that hear trade cases. The Court of International Trade and the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. So one of the things to think about is what is the role of the private sector in setting trade policy. Basically in Washington, we call this lobbying. Private sector can mean individual companies. It can mean industry trade associations. In this context, it can also mean foreign governments. So all of these entities can engage in Washington and work to influence the legislative branch and Congress, and individual members of Congress, as well as the executive branch. So lobbying can be direct. You can meet with members of Congress, or more likely their staff. You might want to talk about legislation that's already been introduced. You might want to influence how it's sort of redrafted before it comes up for a vote. You might want to push new legislation. There's a number of things that you can get members of Congress to do on your behalf, or ask them to do, I should say. You might want them to intercede with the executive branch, with the president, on a particular issue related to a policy matter. You also can lobby the White House. in addition to executive branch agencies. Again, you're talking about policy issues. You could be talking about tariff issues. So that is something as well that goes on in Washington. There's also sort of indirect ways that the private sector can work to set trade policy or influence trade policy. Think about advertising or messaging. The sort of private sector may fund think tanks who do research and put out reports that sort of may have a particular focus because the entity funding the research wants that focus to be the sort of is the reason that they're funding the research. Individual companies and individual people, American citizens, can provide contributions to political campaigns, to politicians, that also can have an impact on whether your issues move forward in a way that you want them to. There are also, when we're talking about trade cases, so a little bit, let's talk down a little bit, down in the weeds a little bit, because we're going to be talking about trade cases and sort of trade policy issues. We have, and I know Vanessa's going to talk about some of these, we have a lot of different types of trade actions. I think we're probably hearing about a bunch of them now with the new Trump administration. Some of those trade actions are triggered by the private sector, so they can request, file a petition with the specific agency that's relevant to ask the agency to initiate a type of investigation. For example, an investigation that looks at unfair pricing or foreign government subsidization of exports to the United States. And the U.S. might initiate a case to look at whether the U.S. industry is economically harmed by reason of those imports. Again, most of these types of trade actions are triggered by companies themselves, but there are, with a few exceptions, those types of investigations or cases or actions can also be self-initiated by the U.S. government. So typically by an agency like the Commerce Department. So those types of trade cases, the sort of anti-dumping, countervailing duty cases, normally are initiated at the request of domestic manufacturers, but they can be self-initiated by the Commerce Department. So that's my quick overview.
Thank you very much, Stacy. And how about before we move to the next section, I had a first question for you. Like, would you mind giving us an example of one of these trade cases or trade actions that can be triggered by the private sector? Maybe something a little bit current that you have seen in your career, or something that you have seen in your career, or something that you've seen currently, just to show that it's not only the U.S. government that sets policy. So the point here is that it's not only President Trump who might give us a surprise down the road, but it can be also the private sector. So would you mind, telling us a little bit about one of these examples and how they usually tend to play out?
Sure. Something that's quite well, it's been around since the first Trump administration, but we recently, the U.S. Government under President Biden sort of reviewed the China 301 tariffs, we call them, right? So those were put in place again during the first Trump administration, and after the agency did an investigation into China's IP practices, intellectual property practices, determined to impose tariffs on the vast majority of imports from China. There was a process that individual companies could go through to try and get products excluded. And so companies filed literally thousands of requests. In addition to filing requests, they also sought out the support and assistance from their members of Congress. They might have gone in to meet with USTR or also the Commerce Department that was assisting on this. In this recent round, this review that was required, there was a lot of input from associations, from individual companies on, hoping to either have tariffs reduced, eliminated. There were certain companies and industries maybe that wanted tariffs raised. As Vanessa mentioned, ACP and SIA often work together. So we work together to talk to the executive branch in the hope that we could have some tariffs either reduced, eliminated, but certainly not increased. And we had that success. We brought the sort of our entire industry together to talk to the officials and to provide the reasoning and rationale for why it would be in the best interest of the United States to not raise tariffs on certain products that perhaps we did not make here in sufficient quantities or were not available to source from anywhere but China. So that's a situation a recent situation where we've successfully engaged the government.
And a follow-up on that, Stacy, like in the case that you are mentioning, for instance, we live in a we live in a world where information and hard data seem not to have an effect on policy, or that we seem to care more about like feelings and about other stuff. So what makes an industry successful in pushing for a specific policy based on your experience?
Well, there's a couple ways to answer that. So, I mean, one is facts and data. I mean, the example that I gave, ACP and SIA, Vanessa and I went in with data that supported our arguments about why tariffs should not be increased on certain products. And, the Biden administration and the Trump administration are very much focused on continuing to grow domestic manufacturing. And so we made arguments that were tied to that, the need for tariffs not to be increased so we could continue to grow domestic manufacturing, which in turn provided jobs, which in turn created sort of energy resilience in the United States. And so those kinds of arguments are very successful. There are other ways to influence administrations, that could be if you're a very powerful player in business, and then there are governments also that engage on behalf of their businesses and may have influence over the U.S. government. They make arguments that we're a close ally with the United States. We can supply this product, we want to be able to do that. And, they'll make arguments that are relevant depending on the proceeding we're talking about that might persuade the United States government that it is in their best interest and the interests of close allies to, provide some leeway for our close allies under certain circumstances.
Oh, thank you very much for the explanation, Stacy. And going back to the legal framework, you just discussed an example of what the 301 tariffs, like how that can go about. But in general, you worked for Senator Schumer. How hard it is for the legal framework to change? Is it pretty stable over time? Does it change very often? And if so, what are the determining factors there as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Most of the trade laws have been around for a very long time, and they are hard to change because it requires an act of Congress. So again, the House of Representatives is majority rule. So if you had the support of the whatever party was the majority in that particular time, that might be easier to get it to pass the House. In the Senate, the Senate has a tendency to work on a more bipartisan basis because in most cases you have a 60 vote threshold. So out of the 100 senators, you need to get 60 to agree to sort of move. We'll go into the details, but to agree to move forward on voting on the legislation, right? So it is difficult. You have everybody sort of lobbying for how they want if there's going to be a change in the law, what that's going to look like. And so it is quite hard to pass legislation. It requires a lot of work and effort and a lot of compromise. And usually things don't get done with compromise. And, more recently, there's been less willingness to compromise. So it makes it harder to pass legislation.
Understood, Stacy. Definitely we live in in a time of polarization. So probably we won't. Would you say that? Well, I will ask Vanessa that question based on the framework. But the last thing that maybe I would want you to cover, Stacy, is maybe can you give us one of the most important things for Mexico, as you know, is the USMCA. Would you mind giving us an overview of how treaties are approved by the US and implemented? So that, because, you know, there were a lot of questions the first time that Trump came to power about whether the president could withdraw from a treaty on his own. So would love to hear your takes on this and just an overview.
Sure. Let me start with the first question, and then I'll talk about the question about withdrawal. So under the U.S. system, things like international trade agreements, they're not self-executing, meaning that some countries, you know, if you agreed, say, to the WTO, some countries may take the literal language of that agreement, and that becomes reflected in their domestic law. Other countries, like the United States, takes, you know, that's their starting point. They then sort of interpret it and craft legislation to implement what it has agreed to in, for example, sort of the WTO. So something like, you know, with NAFTA and then USMCA, to the extent that there are obligations in that agreement that require under US law that they be incorporated or sort of codified in US law. And so legislation would be drafted and that would have to pass Congress. But so that's sort of generally how sort of our sort of codification or implementation of trade agreements takes effect. You also then have you may have, like, under NAFTA, Vanessa and I met when we were doing negotiations on NAFTA implementation and rules for the 3 countries about dispute settlement. So there are sometimes agreements that require sort of their own separate set of agreed upon rules for how the parties will work on things like binational panels and things like that for dispute settlement. Those are negotiated directly between the governments of the 3 parties. Sometimes there are just regulations that need to be put into domestic law of the particular country. Your question about sort of, can the president withdraw from, say, USMCA? There's no specific answer to that other than what's reflected in the text of the agreement. So typically a trade agreement will, or even agreements that are sort of big multinational agreements that aren't necessarily trade agreements, will have a specific provision related to a process for withdrawing from that agreement. And they're all different. So, you know, whether, like, the president just withdrew the United States again from the Paris Accord, right? And by the terms of the Paris Accord itself, it doesn't take effect for a year. But from a political perspective, the president has withdrawn the United States from the Paris Agreement. So sometimes they're, you know, the politicians make a decision and characterize that decision how they want to, or what they think is accurate, or what they want it to be. And then there are the terms of the agreement itself. So those things may not always align directly. But again, most of these agreements talk about the process, the timing, the impact for withdrawing from an agreement. And USMCA has those provisions in it.
Understood, Stacy. No, thank you very much for that overview. And from what I understand is then it depends on the treaty itself, right? Like it's on a case-by-case basis. All right.
Yes.
All right. No, thank you very much, Stacy. So before we move on to the next section, I want to ask our audience if you have any questions. If you want to type them in Spanish, I'll be very, very happy to translate them. So I'll give you a minute for that. I don't see any questions.
Can I add? I'm going to add something to what Stacy said. So
yes.
President Trump did try to withdraw from USMCA once before when he was president the first time. And I was involved with a group of lawyers who looked at that because it was our belief that if he tried to do it, we could go to the court. and seek an injunction against that based on the statute and the legislation. So I think it's safe to say that if he were to try to withdraw from the agreement without congressional consent, he would immediately be in court. The courts would have to decide that issue. And I think, like most courts, you know, you have to see who you pull as a judge and see how well you litigate the case. But I think there's a strong argument, having looked at legal briefs on this, that we're prepared. We never use them because he never did withdraw. But I just want you to know that there are a lot of lawyers in Washington who've looked at this. And I think there's a strong argument that he could not withdraw without congressional consent, but it would be litigated. There's no question that he could try to do it and people would go to court, and then it would be up to the courts to decide.
Understood, Vanessa. And is there any precedent for that? I understand there's not, but what would be the timeline for that? Do you have a sense of?
Oh, in terms of the court? Well, I think there's two timelines. One is what we're seeing play out right now with the Trump administration, which is injunctions, which are immediate orders from courts to keep the status quo as it is before the litigation begins. So that's sort of the first legal stage. And then, of course, there's the merits stage where you have to argue the full legal case and get a decision from the court. In cases, as you've seen over the last few days, the lawyers who've attacked the Trump administration have done both, sought both forms of relief. And I think that's up to each, court to decide whether it wants to grant the injunctive relief in the first instance, and then whether it's the merits decision takes a lot longer. In our court system, I would say an average time frame for a case like that is 18 months to allow the briefing and the argument and the judge to make a decision. So, the injunction decision is usually pretty quick. The merits decision, much more lengthy.
Thank you for the explanation, Vanessa. And well, I think that we can jump right into an update on where things stand. I think it's been a pretty long week and a half.
Day 11. It's only the 11th day. So
exactly.
It feels like it's been the 11th year, but it's only been the 11th day.
There's a Twitter account counting the weeks. There's another Twitter account counting the days. So there's those resources out there.
Yes, we're all a little tired, but that's okay. We'll get better. Our it's like running a marathon, Rodrigo. Our endurance will improve as we practice.
I'm sure it will.
So I am going to not answer the question that everyone wants me to answer, which is what's going to happen on Saturday. There is some relatively recent posting on that from the president, but let me start with sort of the bigger picture, and then I will address the question of what I think is going to happen on Saturday. There was a lot of discussion during the presidential campaigns about trade and tariff. President Trump probably used the word tariff more often in his campaigning. The word tariff probably came up almost as much as any other word. He has told people that he loves tariffs and loves the word, and he has shown himself, as a result of his first term, to be very good and very efficient at using tariffs. So it was a bit of a surprise on the date of the inauguration, January 20th. There were sort of two surprises. The first surprise was he did not enact any tariffs on January 20th, even though he had told everyone repeatedly that he would. And the other surprise was a relatively detailed memo that he wrote to his cabinet on the evening of the inauguration, which is public, called the America First Trade Policy. You can find it on the White House website. And it is a very detailed roadmap for what the administration is planning to review in the short term and think about in terms of tariffs and trade. There are 23 listed items, but I'm going to ignore one of them because it's relatively minor. But the 22 items that I think are substantive are divided between three agencies, and they're agencies that Stacy has already mentioned. The largest share of the 22 items in terms of leadership goes to our Department of Commerce, which is one of our largest agencies and has a lot of control over commercial relations, both export and import. The second group of sort of in terms of number of work streams that was set forth goes to USTR, which, as Stacy said, is part of the Office of the President and is the U.S. agency that is usually in charge of trade negotiating, the actual negotiating job. And there's a third group of actions, a smaller group that have been assigned to the Department of the Treasury. So all of those agencies have been given specific information as to what they're supposed to write about. They're supposed to produce reports on each of the 22 items by April 1st. There's a lead agency, and then they're also instructed who they should consult with among the other agencies. So there is a requirement for them to work with others. But in every case, there's a lead agency that's responsible for drafting. In the US, we always say the person who has the drafting pen controls the agenda. And so I think it's fair to say that we know which agency is in the leadership role for each of the 22 items. So the items it's a broad list. And honestly, it confirms a lot of what we learned during the campaign in terms of the types of things that the administration is considering. Just broadly, I will quickly touch on what each agency has in its work back bucket. For commerce, they are charged with looking at what's Trump has referred to as a universal tariff. That isn't a term you'll find it in a US statute. It is something he made up, but okay, he's good at branding. And it would be, the theory of this case would be that you would come up with a tariff that you would put on every country or some group of countries on everything they export to the United States. So something very, very much a broad-based tariff that would hit everything, not necessarily discriminating between types of imports. And it might differentiate between types of countries because he's particularly concerned about countries that have a trade in goods deficit, which means that these are countries that sell the United States more goods and products than we export. Canada and Mexico are number 2 and 3 on the list after China. So there are 25 countries that I think are worthy of note. Those are the top 25 countries that have this type of export surplus or import deficit, depending on how you look at it. And I think those countries are most likely to be the target. You can easily find those countries by just looking at the statistics from 2023, and you can see, you literally put into Google and you can see which countries are on the list. They are many of our largest trading partners. So that is Commerce's most important job, I would say, in this list. And they're also asked to look at more aggressive use of a tariff program known as Section 232. That's a reference to the statute that it comes from. Mexican audiences will be familiar with this tariff because it is the tariff that enabled the Trump administration in the first term to put tariffs on steel and aluminum exported from Mexico, along with many other countries. And that program is run by the Commerce Department. As Stacy pointed out, it's a program where people can either seek initiation of an investigation or the government can start one. The Trump administration started 8 tariff investigations under that program and found, and that was the program that they used for steel and aluminum tariffs at a global level, although since then they have exempted and excluded some countries and products, but generally speaking, a very broad program. And then Commerce is also charged with working on the Canada-Mexico migration issue, but we'll get to that in a minute. You can just put that aside for a minute, but they were sort of asked to come up with a sort of a plan on that. The Office of the U.S. Trade Rep has responsibility for reviewing the current 301 tariffs. These are another statutory reference, Section 301. These are tariffs that were originally put in place by the Trump administration on Chinese products, as Stacy pointed out. The Biden administration reviewed that program and enhanced it and added some more tariffs. And the Trump administration, USTR, is now going to look at that program again and make further recommendations about it. They've also been asked to look at a purchase agreement that the Chinese government signed with the Trump administration in the first term. Its acronym is Phase 1. I won't get into the details, but the idea there was that the trade deficit would become less of a burden on the U.S. if China would buy more stuff. And among the things they were supposed to buy was a lot of LNG, civil aircraft, and U.S. Soybeans and grains. And they did not complete those purchases. And as a result, this USTR has been asked to suggest how to fix that problem, how to approach the Chinese on this failure to complete their purchases as they said they would complete them. So that is with USTR. And then most importantly for this discussion, USTR is responsible for the review of USMCA. So in the USMCA, when it was signed in 2020, it contained a provision that all 3 countries agreed to, that in year 6 of the agreement, 2026, the 3 countries would sit down and review the agreement and decide whether they wanted to continue the agreement or terminate the agreement. And it provides a mechanism for them to conduct some renegotiations, to have a full discussion about the value and the problems with the agreement. It's supposed to start by the terms of the USMCA next summer, but there's nothing to prevent the 3 countries from sitting down and starting earlier. That appears to be what's happening. So I think it's fair to say that USTR will be very busy, and they're already working on a USMCA review, as we know Canada and Mexico is doing, but that is USTR has the leadership seat there. The Treasury Department has a smaller list, but the one that is probably most relevant for trade discussions is that they are in charge of looking at currency manipulation. And to the extent that they find that a designation by a country as a currency manipulator would then lead to potential trade actions. And that was looked at in the first Trump administration, most notably with Vietnam. And we could talk about that if people are interested, but that's what Treasury is specifically charged with doing, making determinations based on its expertise, its macroeconomic expertise about whether countries are engaging in currency manipulation to benefit their trade status. So Rodrigo asked me, so there's another big elephant in the room, which is if we have these plans that are being drafted by these agencies and the reports are due on April 1st, why do we have the president doing other stuff? That's because he's President Trump, and he believes that tariffs can be used for various benefits for himself, and one of them is to extract non-trade outcomes. So we saw that with Colombia last weekend, where he and the president of Colombia were engaged in a social media war about whether the planes with migrants could land or not, and who was in the plane, and whether people were shackled or not. And that was resulted in threats on Saturday and Sunday of 25% tariff on Colombian exports, particularly painful if you are in the floral business, because that's where we get all our cut flowers from, and Valentine's Day is 2 weeks away. But it was settled through diplomatic means, and he backed off of his threat, and no tariffs were imposed. But that is the same basic argument he's making with respect to the issue of migrants and fentanyl trade. And that is what is leading to this potential set of tariffs on February 1st, which is Saturday. He would probably, in order to sort of make these threats real, he would have to rely on an emergency power statute. It's known by its acronym IEEPA. And that would allow him to declare a national emergency caused by a foreign power. And if he does that, he has certain trade authorities that are granted under that statute, and he would presumably use that as a basis to raise tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports. About an hour ago, he made statements that suggested that he was serious about this. I think there are a lot of people who think that is still not going to happen just because of the macroeconomic problems it would create. There are significant trade flows between the three countries, but the three industries that would be most heavily affected would be U.S. refineries. We import all our crude oil from Canada and Mexico, and those refinery jobs would be in peril if the oil stopped flowing. The second area would be food. It's winter in the United States. We are very addicted to our fruits and vegetables, and obviously, Mexican growers are supplying the vast majority of those fruits and vegetables to us right now. So that would be a huge problem for grocery prices. So that would be a problem. And automobile manufacturing would be impacted because, as many people know, we make automobiles in North America with all three countries contributing significantly to the manufacture. And if we were to stop or put large tariffs on those parts, there would be a problem for U.S. auto manufacturers who probably would have to really rethink how they're going to make cars in the short term, putting auto jobs at peril. If you think about it, those are all voting groups that are heavily impacted: U.S. consumers of food, U.S. refinery jobs, and U.S. auto workers. And the danger is that if he does something on Saturday night and it's not quickly unwound, we start to see some real economic effects on the U.S. economy, probably most notably inflationary, at a time when we're trying to land our inflation numbers at a lower number. Adding on top of that, I think that Canada and Mexico have made it clear that they are not going to be shy about retaliating in kind. And that will also cause particular problems for some of U.S. industries. So if that all happens and the president carries that out, that will be very disruptive. I also think they're going to get sued if they do this in court. I think that their decision to do this under IEEPA will test that statute. It has not been tested in the courts on this particular topic. So I think there will be a lawsuit filed, one or more. And immediately there will be a request for injunctive relief and all the things I already talked about. So a kind of a rocky weekend that we're all looking at, unless some solution is found or the president is talked out of this by Saturday night. But it's looking, as of today, it's looking not great, basically on what he just said about an hour ago in a press statement. So there's that going on, even though we have all this roadmap April 1st stuff. A couple additional comments. Why haven't we seen tariffs on China? I think there's really one answer, and that is TikTok. President Trump has decided he's going to solve the TikTok problem, assuming we have a TikTok problem. I guess we do. I'm not a big TikTok person. But he thinks he can convince the Chinese government to sell the business, which really means selling the algorithm, which is the value proposition. And he wants to do it quickly before TikTok loses more market value. And he is committed to doing that. And it's hard to do that when you are putting tariffs on the people you're negotiating with. So I think the TikTok negotiation is actually ongoing. And I think that's one of the reasons he's sort of paused on the China tariffs, even though he's been talking about them a lot. Their additional problem is they have been very slow to onboard their economic team. Their commerce secretary has yet to be sworn in. Their USTR has not even been through the confirmation process that Stacy discussed. There are very few staff personnel in either commerce or USTR. The Treasury Secretary has been sworn in, but as I noted earlier, he has a smaller role to play. So there just literally are not the bodies in place to carry out a lot of complicated administrative actions, which are what trade requires. It's just, these are very complicated technical things. And if you don't have experienced people in place, it becomes very hard to execute quickly on some of these things. So I think that has slowed them down as well. There's also infighting among the White House staff about what type of tariffs to use. There is the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, who believes you should use something broad but low, like tariffs on everybody, but a low level. And there are other people represented by Peter Navarro and some others who think you should do really high tariffs on certain countries, very dramatically signaling to those countries that they are the problem. China would be in that category, but Mexico and Canada potentially because of the size of the trade deficits. And those two factions are sort of disagreeing with each other. And that is probably also slowing down the decision-making at the White House. But all that being said, President Trump is a very strong personality. And if he feels like he wants to do something on Saturday, he will find people to write an order that says he can do it, even if it results in a court challenge on Monday morning, which it may. The last thing I'll say is I think everybody should understand one fundamental truth here. There will be tariffs, new tariffs, on U.S. imports. It's just a question of which tariffs and when they happen. But there's no doubt in my mind that we don't get through this year without additional tariffs of some kind. I don't have a lot of ability to predict who will be affected and how fast they will be implemented and what the number will be. But I think it's fair to say we're facing into a relatively rough economic future because tariffs are very destructive macroeconomically, and they have a lot of unintended consequences for lower income people, for example, and for industries that just find themselves caught up in a tariff war that they didn't start. Another industry might have started, but they have sort of a collateral effect on people. I think we saw that with steel. People who are industrial users of steel didn't start the tariffs, but they've been the recipients of a lot of the damage that's caused. So it's tariffs are a dangerous tool to play with, and they're very hard to control once they're unleashed. So I think we're looking into a relatively rough, 4 years on that front. Quickly, I think you asked me 2 other questions. What is different this time around, and USMCA? What is different this time around? The approach of the Trump 2 is different. They have a very much storm the field mentality. They're trying to do as much as they can as quickly as possible. Second thing that's different is they don't seem to care if they get sued. And they've been sued every day since the inauguration on all sorts of things. And that doesn't seem to be a problem. They're happy to go into court. They think that they have a pathway to win. We'll see. Our court system is relatively robust, and we have a very strong pathway after the Supreme Court. So we'll see how quickly these cases move through the system, but almost everything that they're doing is getting challenged. And as I said, I think some of their trade actions will get challenged as well. His staff choices are more unconventional in looking at historical choices for heads of agencies and staff personnel, very much loyal to the president. One contribution to the wrong party can get you kicked off a list. I can tell you that happened today. Somebody who said they were going to a certain agency was told today they were not, because it was determined that they had made a one-time contribution to a member of the Senate who was a Democrat. So that is a very strict test that was not applied the first time around. And actually, I think on the trade side, we have a danger of fewer sort of seasoned people going back into the administration. Many of the people who served in Trump 1 have decided not to go back in. And those are some of the better, smarter people, I think, who worked for President Trump the first time. And I am worried about a little bit of a quality problem. They seem to be pulling in a younger, less experienced group of people. And that will mean a lot of learning for those people, less familiarity with the way things are done. And honestly, as Stacy can attest, trade is really hard. It's enumerated by tons of statutes and regulations. It's not something you can take home and read overnight and learn. And so if you don't have that familiarity, you're at a disadvantage if you're trying to run trade programs. And I am concerned that that's one of the problems we're going to encounter with some of these people who don't really have a deep background in trade. So that makes the agencies potentially less skillful at carrying out their mandates. So those are all differences from the first time around. USMCA, just a few points on that, and then we'll go into questions. I've had a lot of questions from people about how would he do tariffs on Saturday. And the answer is he doesn't have to withdraw from the USMCA. He can use an escape hatch that all trade agreements include, called the National Security Provision. So all trade agreements the U.S. signs have a provision that says in cases of national emergency, effectively, a president can decide to do something that violates the agreement as long as he can explain that it's a national security imperative that he do it. And that is likely to be the explanation he gives for why he's essentially breaching the agreement. Canada and Mexico may not agree with that, and they have a right to bring an arbitration about it, but in the short term, that would be his likely reason for doing tariffs. What does he want? I think what he really wants is like an early harvest on USMCA. I think they have no patience with waiting till 2026. They want something early, and they want something robust. And it's not really clear what they want. I mean, it looks like it's cast as issues of migrants and fentanyl. My suspicion is it's much deeper than that. I think the central thing that they are really concerned about is Chinese investment in Mexico and Canada. And they want to punish that. They want to prevent Chinese investors from benefiting from getting in their products into the United States for no duties. They call it a circumvention of 301. So if you're thinking about all the products that have tariffs coming from China, and you're the Trump administration, your next target is everybody who moved their operations out of China to a third country and made the product, and is then using that country to get in around the 301 tariff that was put on the product coming directly from China. And that is probably one of their most important issues with Canada and Mexico that they want Canada and Mexico to address. So that is, I suspect there's a lot of conversation about that, and getting something from Canada and Mexico sooner rather than later is probably one of the reasons for all this pressure. So I'm going to stop and let Rodrigo kind of throw questions at me.
Sure. No, thank you very much, Vanessa, for such a thorough explanation. Just one of the questions from the audience is if it's possible to sue in a court against the imposition of tariffs on Mexican products. Can the Mexican state file a lawsuit in the U.S.?
Probably not.
Okay.
Foreign governments don't have standing in most cases to challenge an active state. The remedy under the USMCA is that they bring an arbitration, which is allowed. Stacy and I wrote most of those rules or helped write those rules, and we've seen a number of arbitrations take place. Mexicans will be very familiar with the auto case. There's a corn case. There are potential energy case. There's a whole bunch of issues that have been arbitrated or subject to arbitration. The problem with the arbitral remedy is it takes a long time. A panel has to be convened. There has to be there's an enforced mediation period. So it's just a long process to get from the beginning of the arbitration to the end of the arbitration. But I would think that if he does do this 25% tariff on Saturday that, Sunday, Mexico and Canada will file an arbitral request and say he's not meeting the terms of the national security exception, and they will seek an arbitration. And it's very hard under the current system for the U.S. to block that. In the NAFTA, it was easy. That was fixed, actually. And so there probably would be an arbitration, but it wouldn't be decided in the short term. And these kinds of things are really diplomatic. As we saw with the Colombians last weekend, it's really a subject to diplomatic maneuvering. And I think that's what he wants. I think if he does do something on Saturday, he means to call everybody to Washington the next week and get everybody to sit around a table, and there will be demands made. Some of them, as I said, may be about this issue of Chinese circumvention. I suspect the other demand will be the deficit issue. Buy more stuff. What are you going to buy from us to make the deficit go down? You're not buying enough, and you need to buy more things. And here are things you could buy from us that you're not buying, and this is why you should buy them. And you should reduce the deficit by doing that. That'll be more challenging, I think, in our hemisphere than it would be, for example, with the Europeans. He said that to Europe, and he said buy LNG, and they've said maybe, because they're going to be needing a lot of LNG, and US is going to be exporting a lot. So depending on where you sit and economically what you're dependent on, it might be easier to say I'll buy more stuff. But it's Canada and Mexico. We have a relatively well-developed relationship in terms of who buys what, and I don't sense that there's a lot of room to sort of change that dramatically. I think it works really well, actually. So I'd be curious to see what exactly he wants, in addition to the migration and fentanyl concerns, which I believe, honestly, I think Canada and Mexico are trying to address and doing, from what I've heard, making real headway there. It just may not be enough to satisfy him by Saturday.
And when you said, Vanessa, just to follow up on that, when you said that IEEPA had never been tested in courts, it would be by the private sector in the US, I guess. Or
well, right. I mean, no one, first of all, no, technically, there was a precursor to IEEPA that President Nixon used to put a surcharge on some imports, but no, since IEEPA was passed, this economic power statute, no president has ever used the tariff provision. So we don't actually know what happens if he does and what the parameters of it are, right? But you can imagine a court case where someone goes in to tell the judge, we think this use of this authority has the following problems. And our federal judicial system has recently dealt with a lot of issues about whether Congress has properly delegated to the executive branch. There's a concept of over-delegation, where where the Congress has been told you delegated too much power, you abrogated your power. You are supposed to make the laws. You can't give the executive branch the chance to make the laws. So there's a whole line of thought there. There are other challenges in our sort of administrative state in terms of things you could bring. There's probably a due process problem. You may not be able to impose tariffs on people without a certain amount of time and notice. So all of that creates a vulnerability, I think, in using IEEPA without having it tested in the court. So I think there's a good likelihood that there'll be a lawsuit if they do something on Saturday. But by American companies and American trade associations, just to be clear.
Yeah. Okay, understood. Yes. No. Thank you very much, Vanessa. With that, I will move to you, Tom. So I think it will be really interesting to know, how the supply chain works for your company, for EDPR. What's your experience in the past? You're a de facto trade lawyer. I don't want to offend the lawyers here, but you're a lawyer too. So I always regret not being a lawyer when I'm around you guys. So, but yeah, maybe can you get us started on that and walk us through the supply chain, how it is affected, and how do you do it to navigate uncertainty?
Sure, I'll do that at a high level, Rodrigo. And
yep.
These two lovely women are legitimate trade experts. I'm just, I guess you could call me a trade victim to some extent, since I spent most of my career being able to avoid getting involved in trade matters, but have had to, as a matter of the requirement, basically, of being in the clean energy sector and in responding to the tariffs that have been imposed across, really very broadly across the clean energy sector, particularly on solar power. And fortunately, I get to draw on brilliant and talented people like Stacy and Vanessa to help guide my company through these issues. So what I want to do is just offer a few minutes of comments on, how a company like mine is affected by the sorts of trade measures that we've been discussing. And I'm going to start by stating that sort of the obvious, which is that trade laws and the resulting tariffs affect a business like mine in two major ways: price and supply. And price impacts are pretty obvious and direct. Tariffs imposed on imported products are typically borne by the importers, the companies that do the importation, who are often affiliated with the exporters, but that gets complicated, so we'll just leave it at that. So they're borne, the tariffs are borne by the importers, but also typically then passed on to consumers. So in my position, for example, I work closely with the procurement team at EDP Renewables, and over the course of the last few years, it's been frankly pretty insane to be trying to make procurement decisions. I will note that our procurement decisions, just because of the price impacts of tariffs, okay, there's other issues that we'll talk about in a second. And just to give some context for that, we're typically making procurement decisions, in my company's case, buying literally hundreds of megawatts, which is essentially, tens to hundreds of millions of dollars of solar and wind and battery storage equipment. We're making those procurement decisions typically for projects that are not actually going to be constructed for 2 to 4 years. Okay, so since the product we're signing contracts now for, just for example, solar panels that may not actually be delivered or may not even be imported to the US for 2, 3, or even 4 years. And that means that we're essentially in the business of trying to anticipate what tariffs are likely to be imposed and what the impacts of those tariffs are likely to be. That's a very, very uncomfortable position to be in, okay? So that's the price impacts. The supply impacts are less direct, but they're also very meaningful. So first, some foreign manufacturers may choose not to export their products to a particular geographic market, in our example, the US, when that market imposes tariffs. And second, depending on the elasticity of supply, those imported products now tariffed, right, may be disfavored by consumers because they're more expensive. So that's back to price impacts. But so basically, you may have supply usually constrained by the imposition of tariffs because the companies that you previously were buying from are for a variety of reasons are constrained from importing their products in the same volume or obviously at the same price because of the tariffs. These impacts can be really material. And the most obvious example in the space that I work in, that we all work in, which is the clean energy space, is that the price of solar panels in the United States is now roughly twice, the number fluctuates a little bit, but roughly twice the average global price for solar panels, okay? So think about that for a sec. That means that we are uniquely in that position. I mean, there may be some smaller importers that impose comparable tariffs that I'm not aware of, but of the major markets for solar power in the Americas, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, the US is alone, essentially, in paying a price that's roughly twice the average selling price for solar panels across the whole rest of the world. So that has implications important implications at a macroeconomic level. For example, in spite of those tariffs, because the US economy overall can be pretty resilient, solar represented, I just looked at a figure today, about 82% of the new generation capacity installed in the United States last year, at least through November. It was January through November. We don't have December data yet. About almost 82% was solar power, okay? And still a majority of those solar panels were imported, and virtually all of those imported solar panels, I shouldn't say virtually all, but many or most of those solar panels had tariffs imposed on them. What that means is that those price impacts are ultimately, as I said earlier, passed through to consumers, which means most American consumers are paying more for electricity, certainly for solar electricity, than they otherwise would have to in a more unfettered market. So that's just one example of the kinds of impacts that these price and supply dynamics can have. Interestingly, tariffs also have an impact, at least in theory, which I'll explain, on the domestic production of the tariffed products. Both President Trump in his first term and President Biden in his term, justified the imposition of tariffs in a substantial part because they said they were trying to promote bringing manufacturing back to the United States, in particular manufacturing of those tariffed products. This is not new to these two presidents. We've been imposing tariffs for a long time on timber products, for example, on steel products, as Vanessa and I think and Stacy both mentioned, for a long time. But the tariffs on these clean energy products are really, especially on solar panels, they're originally about 10 years old, but the vast majority of them are new really since the first Trump term. And so you would expect there would have been a significant response to those tariffs, and that response would have been stimulating new domestic manufacturing of solar panels. But and I'm not the expert here, so I'd love to hear Vanessa's and Stacy's perspective on this. But my personal experience with this has been that throughout Trump's first term and into Biden's second term, the effects that you might have expected with respect to commitments to increase investment in domestic solar manufacturing in the United States didn't happen. They just didn't happen. There are bits and pieces, but not in any material effect that would have had any measurable, really significant impact on the overall supply. Now, interestingly, from my perspective, President Biden chose a different approach for stimulating domestic investment, which was essentially, to use the old expression, to use carrots rather than sticks. In other words, incentives or subsidies rather than tariffs, right? And those measures, which made up, as most of you I'm sure know, the core part of the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed in August of 2022, almost immediately had an immense stimulative effect on domestic investment in solar manufacturing in particular. And there were a lot, huge amounts, tens of billions of dollars announced worth of announcements of new factories, sort of across the supply chain for solar, and other similar announcements with respect to battery storage and other clean energy technologies. So it's just an interesting, observation from my perspective that tariffs, which are often defended or described as, or justified as having that sort of stimulative effect on stimulating domestic production of that tariff product, in practice, in my limited experience, have not really had that effect. And I'm sure there are reasons that the smart folks like Stacy and Vanessa can tell us about the why of that, but I'm just conveying that that's been my own professional experience. So let me wrap up by noting that that I think my overall lesson from all this is that many people have said that in business, if you're in business as I am, that one of the biggest enemies to business is uncertainty, and the trade measures that we've discussed create tremendous uncertainty, and with uncertainty comes risk, and with risk comes instability. And so, to me, overall, the experience that I've had with tariffs in the clean energy sector in the United States, particularly those that started with the beginning of Trump's second term around 2017, that the overall effect has been to reduce investment in the clean energy sector in the United States relative to what we otherwise would have had. And of course, someone could respond to that by saying, but wait, there's been tremendous growth in the clean energy sector in the United States, which I absolutely acknowledge. But my point is that growth could have been substantially greater in the absence of the uncertainty and risk created by these trade measures. And frankly, given my own personal and professional passion for driving the clean energy transition and combating the effects of climate change in the U.S. and around the world, that's unfortunate, because as well as we've done in promoting and stimulating investment in clean energy in the United States, that we could have done even more and stimulated more of that transaction more quickly. One final point, I'm not suggesting that there aren't good reasons for tariffs other than stimulating domestic manufacturing. There are good reasons. I think, the perspective of many Americans, I sort of half joke that the only thing that Democrats and Republicans agree on these days in the United States is that they both love to hate on China, to use the expression. So I think that there is some legitimacy behind that, in that China is and acts like an economic hegemonist. They want to sort of take over the world from an economic perspective, and that the U.S. and other countries have legitimate concerns in terms of national security interests in dealing with the government of China in a variety of ways. And I think that, I understand the ideas behind having policies that reduce dependence on products imported from China, particularly in key economic and industrial sectors like energy and telecommunications, and computers and technology. But again, my personal experience has been focused mostly on the clean energy sector. And what I've seen there, really, to sum it up in one sentence, is I've really seen the disruptive impacts of a sort of near constant barrage of new trade measures directed at clean energy technologies.
Thank you very much, Tom, for this overview. Given that we're focusing on the impacts of the Trump presidency, how has the arrival of President Trump to the White House changed this the way you look at trade policy and the way that you are looking at these sources of uncertainty that are tariffs, if at all, if there's been a change?
Well, I think both Stacy and Vanessa alluded to this. I mean, we're sort of waiting for the other shoe to drop. It's another expression that I hope translates well to this audience. In other words, Vanessa in particular pointed out that it's been a surprise that we haven't seen more aggressive pronouncements coming out of the Trump 2 White House on trade issues yet. But I think the key term there is yet. And I like Vanessa, I'm expecting that we will see trade actions. I expect we also will see some trade actions that certainly affect the clean energy sector. He really targeted that sector to a large extent in his first term, and he's done lots of other non-trade related things that target incentives for the clean energy sector in this first 9 days or 10 days or whatever it is in office. So I expect there will be tariffs, more tariffs imposed, and perhaps other types of trade measures, trade restrictions imposed, but we haven't seen any yet. What we have seen, Rodrigo, and I don't want to stray too far from the trade discussion, but what we have seen is measures that clearly other measures that are targeting the clean energy sector, particularly the wind energy sector, an area that Vanessa's organization, the American Clean Power Association, covers. And to me, also, that's just a first step, and I'm expecting that we'll see more measures there. In particular, I expect that in negotiating the language for what's called the reconciliation bill, basically a huge budgetary package that almost certainly is going to reflect President Trump's efforts to renew and perhaps expand the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, that he worked with Congress to enact in his first term. So we will see almost certainly an effort to renew or extend, or both, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And there's already a lot of talk in Congress about him targeting the clean energy tax credits that were a core part of the Inflation Reduction Act as part of working with Congress to enact cuts to those tax credits as part of the effort to get new revenues to offset the loss of revenues associated with those tax cuts.
Thank you very much, Tom. There's one very specific question for you on the chat. It says, could you tell us a bit about how your company prepares when there are announcements of tariffs? Do you take any specific actions other than probably, opening a bottle of tequila and having a drink, of course? But what other specific actions do you take, Tom?
Well, that's one of my favorite actions to take in response to the threat of tariffs, and one, believe me, that I have taken in response to the threat of tariffs. But no, I think it's a great question, Rodrigo, and I think I'm really happy and proud of the relationship that I've developed with the procurement team here at EDP Renewables. That didn't really exist prior to my taking this position about 4 years ago at the company. And that close relationship between government affairs, which I represent, and the procurement team. And we've built a really solid relationship. And really what it is, it's a bit of a guessing game, but they're also, I've already said great things about Vanessa and Stacy and their organizations and their other trade experts whose expertise we rely on to try to, and this is the key word in answering your question, to try to anticipate what trade measures might be imposed, on what products they might be imposed, what the percentage tariff might be, although that's very, very hard. I think the women would agree that that's a very, very hard thing to do, and is a subject of tons of expertise and tons of information and documentation being provided. So, but fundamentally, we have made some major mistakes that cost our company materially. Fortunately, I wasn't involved in making those mistakes. They happened before I arrived, but I was very much here at the company to feel the impacts of those mistakes, and by making our procurement decisions that really depended on one company, one single source, that ended up being a source that was not just tariffed, but actually essentially banished from the country under the terms of the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, which is a whole other subject that we haven't touched on yet. But we learned our lessons from that, and I worked very closely with the procurement team to try to anticipate what the next round of tariffs might be. So that's one thing that we do, and we've done pretty well with that in over the last couple of years. And then I think the other thing that we do is work with our customers and our suppliers. So our suppliers upstream and our customers downstream, to try to, in a fair way, to try to allocate the risk, contractual risk associated with the imposition of those tariffs. And that's a tremendous challenge, but a valuable one, and an important one to try to achieve. And we've done a very good job with that too, essentially spreading or sharing the risk of the imposition of tariffs in case they do end up being imposed on products associated with those contractual commitments that we make.
Thank you very much for such a thorough explanation. I have another question from the audience that kind of ties together two things that you have mentioned, Vanessa and Stacy. But one is, I think that it was pretty clear from your explanation, Stacy, that there's a lot of lobbying to impose tariffs, if I understood correctly, or to set trade policy goals. And Tom is just telling us how the private sector makes some procurement decisions when new tariffs are announced. But is there a way, or is there a precedent? And I think that this is related to what you were saying also, Stacy, when I asked you, like, how are you successful in setting policy? You were talking about the 301 tariffs and how you showed why they didn't make sense. Is it really common for the private sector or can the private sector in the U.S. press or push the U.S. government so that they do not or diminish tariffs? And what are the usual avenues that they use to do this? This is a question from the audience that I'm translating.
It depends on the statutory basis for the tariff. So what I mentioned early on, the anti-dumping and countervailing duty tariffs, so those are AD/CVD for short. Those are trade actions that by law must be initiated if a proper request is filed, and they are, I consider them sort of run-of-the-mill regular types of trade cases. They go through an agency process, all the parties participate, a decision is made. Those decisions are not political. They are based on the evidence on the record, because the cases can be litigated in court, right? The parties that participate in the case have the right to bring a court case if they think that there's an incorrect decision. So that law, the AD/CVD law, has been around for a long time in the United States, in the GATT, and in the WTO. And again, that and the other law called safeguards, which are the sort of 201, and there are Section 201 tariffs on panels and cells as well. They are, I guess they're a little bit different. AD/CVD, despite what people think, it's not a political decision, right? I worked on those cases when I was at the agency. There's not a lot of wiggle room. The law is very detailed, the regulations are detailed, and there's a lot of precedent. I will say on the 201 case, there is a part of that is susceptible to sort of lobbying when the agency does the 201 investigation and makes the analysis and decision. They make a recommendation to the White House, to the president. At that point, the president has the discretion to accept that recommendation or change the remedy that the president wants to impose. So there is some action there. And then these other sort of trade laws that have not been used very much, or haven't been used in a long time, that President Trump used the first time around, as Vanessa mentioned, the 232 on steel and aluminum. That law hadn't been used in decades. It hadn't been used under the circumstances when you're talking about steel and aluminum imports. It's a national security statute that looks at whether imports threaten to impair U.S. national security. The law is quite old, from the 60s, so it doesn't have a lot of what we'd say guardrails, or it has a timing mechanism of when things have to happen. One of those things does not include making them go away. The tariffs, they're going to live forever, right? And there isn't, so they are susceptible to lobbying advocacy by, and many, I think Vanessa mentioned as well, foreign governments came in once President Trump imposed those and negotiated to have their countries exempted, at least sort of at a certain volume threshold, exempted from those tariffs. So there are a small subset of laws that really lobbying is not effective, but there are a whole host of these provisions that have not been used for the purposes that they are now being used, that are very much susceptible to lobbying in the sense that there's room for the executive to make a decision that has to be based on whatever the parameters of that law is and the facts, but there's a lot of wiggle room, right? So there's a lot of room for interpreting the facts one way and making a decision to raise a tariff, lower a tariff.
I'm going to jump in and just give you the counterexample. When I teach this, I tell the students to hold up their iPhone if they have one. Guess what has no tariff? And there's a reason that iPhones have no tariff. Tim Apple. If you have powerful friends, Elon, you're probably not going to have a tariff on your product. So that is that's the political side of what Stacy's talking about. That won't work across every program, but there is no question that there is an ability to have a political calculation factor into these programs, and it will be a challenge, a big challenge for the Trump administration to do something like a universal tariff and not have it poked full of holes, because that's pretty much what happens. The broader your tariff program is, the more likely your tariff program is going to have holes, because it's almost impossible for the political forces that are reviewing the entire political spectrum to not at some point feel like they have to make a special provision for this and that. And if you think about the way that these kind of things work, everybody has a favorite, right? So at some point you start handing out favors, and the favors get problematic because your coverage is no longer as broad as you have told people that it is. And that is the challenge. That is the biggest challenge with making a universal tariff program work. The political pressure will be intense to start making exceptions, and the exceptions will multiply as more and more people weigh in, particularly members of Congress who say, my struggling district and these poor workers are going to make me not vote for something you want unless you make an exception. And all of a sudden exceptions start to swallow the rule, which has happened in many cases in the steel case. Steel tariffs have a lot of exceptions right now because people negotiated, or the U.S. steel industry can't make something, or there are all sorts of examples of where the program has holes, but there are a lot of holes. So I think it's a little more blatantly political than people like to admit.
And to that point, Vanessa, or what I'm hearing, or would you say that a conclusion, or probably you've seen it in the past, that the private sector in Mexico looks for allies in the U.S. So as to try to get the policy outcome that is more convenient?
Of course.
Yeah,
that's what we call political work, Rodrigo. Of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, that's
well, I haven't spent enough time in jail like Peter Navarro to come up with other, crazier ideas or more complicated theories.
No, but I mean, I'll give you a perfect example. If you're a Mexican, if you sell crude oil from Mexico, we know the Mexican state does this, and your refining customers are suffering because you're not sending them the oil, and the refinery jobs are at risk. You're going to have a conversation with that customer, right? You're going to say, well, I'm happy to send you the oil, but I can't, you have to buy it. And if the tariff is too high, you have to tell the president to give you an exemption. And that's a possibility, right? One thing he could do on Saturday is he could say 25% for everything except crude oil. That's a big export for Canada and Mexico. That's a big hole. But for purposes of making it less painful economically, if you were to exempt energy products, that would be a significant lessening of the impact. And there's a possibility he would announce, I've heard that rumor that that's one thing they may just exempt all energy products. So then the burden would be on automobiles and food products, but you would take the pressure off of oil companies, both oil companies selling from Mexico and Canada and oil companies refining in the United States. And I've heard a possibility that they may do something like that, which would not be surprising given his focus on energy. Oh,
thank you very much for such a clear example, Vanessa. Yeah, I was pretty sure that there's some kind of cooperation, and the integration of the economies make this, a reality. We have 5 minutes left. I have a more general question, and probably we'll get to a more specific questions. And please, people from the audience, feel free to keep sending your questions. And Tom Stars was saying that both Democrats and Republicans agree that both of them, there's the anti-China, anti-Chinese Communist Party sentiment has bipartisan traction, right? So given that the U.S. is trying to check China, to check the growth of China, its emergence as a hegemonic power, why is the U.S. picking up? Why do you think that the U.S. is picking up battles with its closest allies? Why would that make sense? Like Mexico, Canada, the European Union. Why do you think that seems to make sense for the Trump administration?
I'll start, being the least expert person ready to answer that question. I don't think, I think you sort of answered your own question, Rodrigo, in the sense that it doesn't make a lot of sense. Okay. In my opinion, I think it's more a matter of his very simplistic approach to considering certain things, and part of his simplistic approach is, as I think Vanessa emphasized, is that he just looks at countries around the world and says, you know, are they buying as much from us as we buy from them? And if the answer is no, then they're a potential target. So I don't think he thinks in terms of longstanding of you know, regional hemispheric interests. I don't think he thinks in terms of longstanding political and economic alliances. I don't think he thinks in terms of that kind of stuff. So I think that's why he doesn't seem, for the moment anyway, to be making a big distinction between Canada and Mexico on the one hand and China on the other hand.
Yeah, if there was a really interesting hearing this week, the Secretary Designate for Commerce, Howard Lutnick, was testifying, and it's worth watching. He must have used the word respect about 50 times. And his theme was, we don't get enough respect. We're the greatest America in the world, and everyone treats us poorly. They don't pay enough tariffs. They don't invest here. They send us things that are made with slave labor. That would be China. And so we want to take a position against the world that makes people respect us. And that's going to involve tariffs and sanctions, and you know, everybody's at risk. We have no true friends. We have only people who are showing us different levels of disrespect. So if you look at things from that worldview, everyone's a potential enemy. People have to buy their friendship, and literally buy it. And that is sort of, if you think of it that, if you look at the world that way, you can kind of understand how they're starting to construct this worldview where they are anti-China, but they're also anti-everybody else. It's just different reasons for being against you, I would say.
Do you have a take, Stacy, or
Yeah, not anything I'm gonna say publicly. Yeah, there's I mean, Vanessa couched it in very erudite terms, but yes, it is like, it may not make sense, but that's just how it is. Like,
and the other thing I would say, which is different about this version of Trump, is it's coupled with a uniquely imperialistic view of the world. So not only do I not get enough respect, but I'm entitled to get things back that I should already have, right? This idea of buying the Panama Canal or invading it or buying Greenland. I mean, it's coupled with you don't respect me, and in order to earn my respect, you're going to have to give me things that are going to enhance U.S. strategic interests, at least the ones that he sees, in a way that we haven't seen in 25 years from a U.S. president. I think someone told me McKinley was the last president who actually annexed and bought foreign territories. A president that President Trump reveres. So this idea that it's sort of coupled with an oddly imperialistic view that we didn't really see that in Trump 1. We're sort of seeing that in the version 2.
Well, we're running out of time. I wanted to thank our panelists for being here, for joining us, for sharing their expertise in this area. I don't think that we could have picked a better time to have this conversation, other than I know that you all are extremely busy dealing with the Trump administration. So I thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us, for sharing this. I would say that as a matter of conclusion, there's still there's a lot of uncertainty coming up for the private sector in the U.S., for the private sector in Mexico. Trade policy is complicated, so we need to keep having a look at it, to keep getting immersed into the weeds, and we'll see if we can ever make sense of the Trump administration and its policy, and if there's any rationality. So thank you very much to our panelists and to our audience. And we look forward to seeing you again here.